Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story. Chapter 984. An incoming hurricane. Something happened to Su Qing. Black clouds seethed in the sky over the forbidden sea. Crimson fire billowed out in all directions, setting everything ablaze. It was a sky of fire now. As the flames dropped down onto the sea, the water itself filled with flames. It became an actual sea of fire. Flame Phoenix's aura accompanied the flames as they spread through the dome of heaven and connected to the sea below. He was questioning heaven, questioning the sea, questioning the birds, and questioning the sea beasts in the water. Where is he? Countless thoughts began to stream into Flame Phoenix's consciousness. Gradually, the thoughts began to merge together as if to form a complete picture. Except, a power with no form, no reason, no result, and no will interrupted the thoughts. It came with no sound or voice, rippling and distorting everything, twisting the void, and causing the thoughts to be nothing but chaos. The flame-wreathed entity that looked like part phoenix and part eagle soared through the sky, letting loose a cry that shook the heavens. A sound that surpassed heavenly thunder exploded out. It was like something that could smash all obstacles, and it caused the interference to instantly shatter. Next, hundreds of millions of sensations poured into Flame Phoenix's mind. Every single one contained Su Qing's aura, as well as traces of Flame Phoenix's feather. Those sensations came from the fish in the forbidden sea, from the countless sea beasts, and even some godly entities. The distribution seemed endless, which obviously wasn't possible. Whoever did this didn't actually erase my karma. It just scattered it all over the place. Flame Phoenix's heart sank. He knew full well that only a god or imperial sovereign could do something like this. His enormous frame dropped from the sky, smashed into the water, and sank down at a high rate of speed, wreathed in flames the whole time. The mutagen in the water evaporated, causing the water to change color. At the same time, hundreds of millions of sensations continued to flood into him. An incense stick of time passed. Countless entities affected by the karma wailed as they burst into phoenix flames and then crumbled into ashes. Backed by the power of the ashes, a low-pitched voice echoed through the forbidden sea. Turtle shell the arousing, fish guts the clinging, fishtail offensive the receptive, nail the creative, halberd the abysmal, loom threads the gentle gate, evening star the sun, malfunctioning spirit, the joyous rises to the look, bird in the grass, using keeping still to seek. The voice echoed loudly through the forbidden sea. The seafloor trembled, and huge waves formed on the surface. An ancient will accompanied it, forming terrifying might filled with hundreds of millions of thoughts. Find Su Qing. Deep on the seafloor within the marine trench was floating fiend, who had erased all traces of himself within the darkness. He was currently outside the bubble, which was completely covered by his bloody flesh strands. As they slowly pulled the bubble toward him so he could absorb it, the sphere of flesh shrank down. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open, and the shears above his head vibrated. Discovered so soon? Floating Fiend's face fell, and he quickly performed an incantation gesture. A host of sealing marks flew into the shears, causing the Grand Emperor's treasure to tremble slightly before going calm. However, only a moment later it started shaking again. What was more, the rust spots on it started to grow larger. It looked like it might bust apart at any moment. Seeing that, Floating Fiend quickly bit the tip of his tongue and spat out some precious Dao blood, which landed on the shears. Blood-colored light shimmered on the shears, and the vibrating again ceased. Yet clearly that wasn't enough. Only moments later, powerful fluctuations erupted from the shears. Floating Fiend's eyes then shone with determination as he lifted his right hand and viciously grabbed his left arm. With a violent jerk, he ripped his arm off and sacrificed it to the shears. By means of the left arm, the shears released a massive amount of might. The authority of erasure in the shears emanated an ancient will, and the trembling ceased. Furthermore, it was locked in that state. However, the price paid, other than Floating Fiend losing an arm, was that a horrendous fissure appeared on the shears. It was something that could not be erased nor repaired. At the same time that the shears ceased trembling, Flame Phoenix looked up, his eyes shining brightly. This person has a Grand Emperor treasure. However, despite the fact that he erased all traces of himself, I can tell where he is from. Flame Phoenix looked over his shoulder at the vivifiant Holy Land. In the brief moment of contact moments before, he had sensed the aura of that location. There was now no need to suppress the fire in his heart. As it erupted, flames burst out around him, and he shot in the direction of the vivifiant Holy Land, immolating the sky and sea alike as he did. Flames raged everywhere. Back in the marine trench, the bubble in front of Floating Fiend, which was surrounded by his own flesh, had been pulled so close to him that he could suck it into his body. A moment later, a fleshy tumor appeared on his shoulder. Eyes narrowing, Floating Fiend spoke coldly into the tumor, saying, "Next, I just need to assimilate it. It'll take some time. But now you can't escape." With that, he stood and looked off into the distance. He was now considering what to do next. He didn't even consider going back to the vivifiant Holy Land. Although the Holy Land might seem like a safe place, he knew that what he had done couldn't be kept a secret forever. It just didn't seem like a good idea to go there. Besides, hiding at home wasn't a long-term solution. The Patriarch is aware of my Tao. There's no need to explain things to him. He obviously approves. In that case, I suppose I should just go into hiding. On the one hand, I can assimilate this little brat, and at the same time, I can just wait for the Empty Star Holy Land to get here with that almighty individual. When Floating Fiend thought about the almighty individual from the Empty Star Holy Land, he shivered instinctively. On the day that venerable individual arrives, it marks the beginning of the glory days of the Holy Lands in revered ancient. Turning, he shot off along the seafloor and vanished in the distance. As he moved along, he kept exerting pressure on the tumor on his shoulder as he assimilated it. A tempest of fire raged across the forbidden sea as Flame Phoenix's wings flapped. Astonishing might weigh down along with terrifying pressure. And it was all focused on the vivifiant Holy Land. The sky was crimson. The forbidden sea seemed to be burning endlessly. Large numbers of non-humans on islands here and there looked up in the dome of heaven with wonder and astonishment. Beneath the surface of the sea, countless entities trembled. They were witnessing the rage of the South Phoenix. Things weren't limited to that, though. Erneu hadn't just sent a message to Second Elder Sister and Huang Yan. Because of the deep unease he felt, he had sent messages to lots of people. That included parties in Sea Sealing County, the imperial capital of humankind, the Moonright region, and even to the Fire Moon Dark Heavens. The contents of the Jade Slip were the same as what he sent to Second Elder Sister. Except there was one additional line. Something happened to Su Qing. Those words spread through the east of revered ancient, creating a massive hurricane larger than anything kicked up by Flame Phoenix. Chapter 985. Dramatic events in the Forbidden Sea. The phoenix flying over the Forbidden Sea shook all living beings. On this day, countless species on islands everywhere looked up to see heaven completely obscured. A crimson glow replaced the normal color of the sky. The surging tempest overhead replaced the air. Burning fire took over the power of the waves. And everything was focused in one direction, bursting with killing intent and rage. The South Phoenix took to the sea. That's Flame Phoenix. What happened to make Flame Phoenix so angry? Voices full of both astonishment and reverence rose up in islands everywhere. Countless gazes focused on the dome of heaven, and the terrifying figure in the tempest there. Speculations ran wild. But regardless, as of this moment, every species in the Forbidden Sea who saw what was happening were stricken with monumental levels of astonishment. And without even thinking about it, all of them started looking in the direction that the tempest was heading in. Above what had once been the Forbidden Sea was the mountain-like vivifiant Holy Land. The mountain was so majestic that it was hard to see the top of it, and the base covered a massive area. Even from a distance, it was possible to see the mysterious magical symbols flowing just under the surface of the mountain. Occasionally, they would collide with each other, causing loud rumbling sounds to echo out. Some were faint, some were like chants, some were violent, some were thunderous. The sounds came from the vivifiant Holy Land's grand protective spell formation, which had been put in place years ago by their peak Grand Emperor. Holy Lands were called Holy Lands because they had Grand Emperors. Back when ancient Emperor Dark Serenity departed revered ancient, The species that qualified to leave with him were naturally those who had grand emperors. Unfortunately, as time went by, for a variety of unknown reasons, the grand emperors perished. That was why the terrestrial-level Holy Lands came to be. When a grand emperor carved out a Holy Land, then perished and no new grand emperor succeeded, then that Holy Land was referred to as terrestrial level. That was exactly what happened with the vivifiant Holy Land. That said, though the Grand Emperor had perished long ago, the grand protective spell formation he put in place had remained there for tens of thousands of years. Unfortunately, the fact that no Grand Emperor had come along to maintain and repair the formation meant it had gradually weakened over the years that passed. Right now, it was far from what it had been at the peak of its mightiness. That didn't mean it was weak, though. The spell formation glittered brightly, and the thousands of kilometers of ice sludge on the surface of the Forbidden Sea trembled in response. Boats couldn't enter that area, and sea beasts didn't dare to go there. As a result, the entire location was like a mountainous island in the middle of the Forbidden Sea. Couple that with the starry sky aura coming off the mountain, and the incredibly ancient air, and it lent an indescribable grandeur to the place. What was more, its interaction with the environment of revered ancient caused swirling mist to billow out from it. As that white mist spread out from the mountain in all directions, it created a strong contrast with the black color of the Forbidden Sea. The end result was that, in the hearts of the many non-humans on nearby islands, the place was like an immortal paradise. But today, a devilish wind had picked up outside of that immortal realm, and it echoed with a devilish sound. That wind was made of fire, and it came from the south. When it appeared, the canopy of heaven turned as crimson as fresh blood. It was as if the end of days had come. Burning black mist on the Forbidden Sea surged, as if innumerable demonic monsters were on the prowl, howling in ghoulish voices. That was only part of the devilish sound. The other part was the screaming of the wind. On this day, heaven howled, earth roared, and all living beings wept mournfully. The sound combined into a deafening, heaven-shaking, earth-shattering cry. The vivifiant Holy Land bore the brunt of the sound. The thousands of kilometers of icy sludge melted instantly. The white mist surrounding it ignited, becoming a part of the fire. And the raging wind quickly made the huge mountain clearly visible. The color red filled the canopy of heaven. Blazing flames covered the Forbidden Sea. The wind howled. And then all of that coalesced into the image of a majestic figure that looked like both a phoenix and an eagle, charging toward the vivifiant Holy Land. The moment he appeared, the figure reached an enormous claw out of the black clouds. Surrounded by lightning, the claw viciously flew toward the mountain. It seemed that the claw was going to rip that mountain off the surface of the sea. Flame Phoenix's claw was like the hand of a god. Where it went, the air shattered, rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth, and the Forbidden Sea sank down. Terrifying might was joined by maddened rage, to spread out in all directions. The fiery flames spread out to cover the sea water and fill the sky. And of course they enveloped the entire mountain. Intense rumbling sounds split the sky and shook the sea. The vivifiant mountain started trembling violently. However, that was when a cold snort coldly echoed out from within the mountain. At the same time, all of the mountain's magical symbols rose up into the air to create a shimmering shield of light. It was the grand protective spell formation. Light swirled dazzlingly in all directions. Within it were countless symbols, all of them radiating majestic power. In an instant, the defensive barrier formed by the shield of light was at maximum power, and it was fighting back against Flame Phoenix's claw. Rumbling sounds echoed out everywhere. Ripples erupted into a large portion of the Forbidden Sea. Enormous waves surged out everywhere. Flame Phoenix's claw couldn't reach the mountain, and instead slammed into the spell formation shield. Within the formation, the Vivifiants were stunned, and looked out in astonishment at Flame Phoenix, who obscured heaven on the other side of the formation. As they reeled, an old man appeared at the top of the mountain. He was the peak imperial sovereign patriarch of the vivifiant species. He looked through the shield at the outside world. He knew who Flame Phoenix was, and was aware of his status in the continent of South Phoenix, and he was able to instantly assess his strength and current state. It fell in line with his previous judgment regarding the strength of the Phoenix. However, when it came to his current state, He wasn't sure what to make of it. He could be considered an extremely rare mutant entity and revered ancient, and even the starry sky in general. He has terrifying god source and yet does not have any of eminent desolation-esque karma. He is walking the path of gods and yet hasn't he ignited any god fire. He is contending with our grand protective spell formation with no god fire, only his own god source. The level of might on display isn't quite at the level of an altar god, nor a grand emperor. But I'm afraid he is roughly on par with me. How did he do this? To get to a level like this with god source reserves alone and no god fire? I've never even heard of anything like that. And if he did ignite his god fire? Patriarch Vivifiant looked incomparably serious. Reserve powers as profound as that could be considered exceptional. This mutant entity has some extremely high ambitions. Does he want to build up enough reserves to unleash them all at one time, ignite godfire, and become a first-level true god? Except I can sense flaws. He is stuck. Some unknown entity trapped him in the continent of South Phoenix in this sea, making it impossible for him to go too far away from it. In order to become a first-level true god, he has to break out of that trap? Having reached this point in his train of thought, Patriarch Vivifiant spoke in a solemn voice that echoed like thunder. Fellow Taoist Flame Phoenix, you're clearly angry, but you still need to explain yourself. Hand over Su Qing. Flame Phoenix responded in a similarly thunderous voice as his claw pressed down onto the spell formation shield. Su Qing? Patriarch Vivifiant replied. He had already come up with some speculations as to why Floating Fiend had come out of seclusion. However, Floating Fiend represented the future of the Vivifiant Holy Land. He was the individual the Patriarch had selected to keep the species safe going into the future, and was in fact the only person who could do it. That made him more important than any other individual in their species. That was especially true considering that the Patriarch had a lingering wound, which would never heal. In fact, it was accurate to say that even if all the other Vivifiants died, as long as Floating Fiend survived, the species could continue. Otherwise, if the Patriarch lived out his days and Floating Fiend perished, then the Vivifiant Holy Land wouldn't continue on for much longer afterward. There were quite a few other Holy Lands which had long been eyeing the Vivifiants. According to the Holy Land's records, over the tens of thousands of years that had passed, all of the other Holy Lands that lost their imperial sovereigns ended up being split up and divided amongst the others. Isn't that what happened to the far dark Holy Land? He couldn't help but sigh inwardly at what was obviously a very thorny problem. In fact, it was downright deadly. But he also knew that Floating Fiend wasn't an idiot, so whatever he had done, he had likely weighed the potential benefits and consequences. There must be something about Su Qing that Floating Fiend felt was such a potential asset to our species that he was willing to risk his life over it. Patriarch Vivifiant frowned and put a surprised look onto his face. The Su Qing you're talking about. Is he the region lord of the Holy Tide and Night Spirit regions? As he spoke, he took out a jade slip and pressed down on it gently, causing a host of images to appear above it. They were individuals the Vivifiants had gathered information about recently. One of them was none other than Su Qing. Fellow Taoist Flame Phoenix, is this the human you're talking about? I've never met him before. He turned to look at his holy land. Have any of you met him before? All of the Vivifiants shook their heads. You see, fellow Taoist Flame Phoenix, the Patriarch said calmly, you're actually being a bit of a bully here. Did you ever consider that you might have gone looking in the wrong direction? However, the moment the words left his mouth, killing intent flared in Flame Phoenix's eyes. Flapping his wings, he flew high up into the dome of heaven. After reaching a certain height, he wheeled around and dove down, trailing fire like a meteor. The entire process went very smoothly, and he didn't lose an ounce of momentum. The air shattered, heaven shook and earth trembled. The sea water boiled, and a terrifying aura built up. The surrounding flames went completely wild. When Patriarch Vivifiant saw that, his heart sank, but his eyes glittered. His immediate plan was to bolster the power of the spell formation and absorb Flame Phoenix's attack. Except that was when intense rumbling sounds could be heard as a massive teleportation portal opened up in the middle of the air. The aura of the Moonlight region erupted out with wild and violent force. Along with it came a cold voice, like a stream of sword energy that could slice through heaven and earth. So what if it's bullying? We'll find out if this is the right person or not after we step through. Out stepped Ninth Sib from the Moonright region, who was also known as Grandpa Ninth. He clearly had a smoldering god cultivation base, but at the moment, he was pulsing with a ferocity that could threaten imperial sovereigns. Behind him came the heir apparent, Princess Brightblossom, Princess Fifth and Eighth Sib. All of them pulsed with immense energy and raging authority that was vastly beyond what they had been like years ago. Li Zihua's children had smoldering god authority that earned them the praise of dark serenity back in the day, which was why they had each been considered a chosen. In the past, they had been tormented by Crimson Mother, but after being freed, how could they possibly be considered ordinary? Here they were. After getting Erniu's message and learning that something happened to Su Qing, they had come as quickly as possible. They had also brought the Moon Rebel Congregation's precious treasure with them. What was even more astonishing was something that Su Qing or Erniu would have noticed immediately if they were present. They all pulsed with the aura of Li Zihua. Linger hurried after them anxiously, a furious glare on her face as she looked at the Holy Land. Seeing that, Flame Phoenix stopped in place. And that was because the moment the Moonright contingent appeared, more majestic teleportation portals opened up. Countless cultivators poured out, all of them bursting with killing intent. It was a huge army from the Holy Tide region. They were here to rescue their region lord. Among them were countless Nightshade high priests clad in violet robes, with violet moon totems on their foreheads. They were from the Violet Moon Temple, there to fight for the Violet Lord. What happened next caused the Vivifiant cultivators to reel, and sent Patriarch Vivifiant's heart racing. An even more majestic teleportation portal glittered into being above the Holy Land. A terrifying destiny aura power emerged from the portal, spreading through the area as a massive army of cultivators stormed out, virtually exploding with killing intent. Leading them was King Firecrusher. And things weren't even over yet. That was because the aura of a god began to emerge from time itself. Dramatic events were unfolding on the Forbidden Sea. Chapter 986. Godly Edict in the East. The sky rumbled, flowing like rippling fish scales, an effect that spread as far as the eye could see. It was as if some immense being were crushing the clouds and causing them to fall like flower petals down to the earth below. The dew in the clouds became like a timescape river, sweeping up the waves of time and then causing them to pause right over the Vivifiant Holy Land. Pressure weighed down on the mountain, the cultivators inside the mountain, and on the sea in all directions. The Vivifiant Holy Land trembled, and ripples flowed out across the surface of their spell formation shield. The cultivators there were shaken and trembling down to their souls. The water in the area sank down, forming a massive whirlpool that reached all the way down to the broken ruins of Forbidden by the Zombie. It was profoundly eye-catching. But what was even more eye-catching were the waves in the dome of heaven, and the god that was emerging. This god had a godly aura that created an imperial robe. Destiny aura made an imperial crown above an expressionless face. Godfire roiled left and right, filled with a powerful air of death. The god had two eyes that were as calm as dead water. That water was dead. But there was something terrifying beneath the surface that, if it were to erupt, would send out heaven-destroying, earth-extinguishing force. This was the godly authority of battle. The god that had emerged was one of the 5 zombie gods of humankind. This was Emperor East Glory. When he stepped out, his eyes were closed. But when they opened, they were pitch black. At the same time, a sensation of destruction and power erupted within him. He was looking right at the Vivifiant Holy Land. The Holy Land trembled as East Glory's voice echoed out. These are the words of Empress Summer Departure, who wishes to ask the Vivifiant Holy Land, considering your species has polluted the karma of Imperial Tutor Su Qing, does this mean you wish for your entire species to die? East Glory's voice rang out like heavenly thunder. Summer Departure was the Empress' new imperial name. All of the Vivifiants in the Holy Land were terrified. Only Patriarch Vivifiant reacted with a mere frown. He opened his mouth to speak, but then in the river of time in the dome of heaven, waves rolled out and the river water turned black as a sinister sensation erupted from within. Astonishingly, a host of corpses appeared within the river, howling in anguish. Similarly, A never-ending host of corpses appeared within the Forbidden Sea. Forbidden by the zombie seemed to be shaking with exceptional intensity. It was almost as if it were on the verge of awakening, and that was because the incoming darkness was a godly authority from the netherworld. The aura of death spread, and from within the black river water overhead, a god emerged. This god also had a godly aura as an imperial robe, with an imperial crown made of destiny aura. This was none other than Emperor Dark War. Of the 5 zombie emperors of humankind, 2 were present. Countless Vivifiants were shaking uncontrollably within their holy land. Patriarch Vivifiant's heart had sunk even further, and inside, he was sighing continuously. His gaze was focused on what lay outside the spell formation. To the east was the seemingly endless army from Sealing County, all waiting in combat readiness. Clearly, a single command would send them out to crush anything in their path. To the south was King Firecrusher, killing intent raging, an army of human soldiers behind him pulsing with baleful auras. To the north was the contingent from the Moonlight region, imposing, threatening, and deadly. To the west were 2 gods with mightiness that shook heaven and rocked the sea. Up above was Flame Phoenix, who had ceased his dive, but whose outstretched wings would shock the highest heavens. Boundless killing intent from all directions was all weighing down on the Vivifiant Holy Land. And they had all come because of Su Qing. Patriarch Vivifiant could only sigh as his fear intensified. Yet there were still more people on the way. The canopy of heaven was split open by a giant that was several tens of thousands of meters tall. It grinned viciously at the Vivifiant Holy Land as it held open the rift in heaven to reveal the world beyond. Astonishingly, what was visible on the other side of the rift was God Mountain, home to the 3 gods of the fire moons. Though separated by the rift, the godly aura from there was still terrifying. Then a cold voice drifted out from God Mountain, through the rift, and down to the Forbidden Sea. Whoever harms our grand dark heaven makes an enemy of the fire moon dark heavens. The words affected the Forbidden Sea itself, causing currents of water to slow, and the Vivifiant Holy Land's spell formation began to tremble. Patriarch Vivifiant had a very serious expression on his face. He knew exactly who the fire moon dark heavens were, and was aware that Sunfire, Moonfire, and Starfire were all terrifying flawless gods. The events that were playing out were now enabling him to personally understand the truth about this Su Qing, whom he had only heard about from reports up to this point. In the east of revered ancient Su Qing was a very significant and important person. Floating Fiend had trifled with someone he shouldn't have trifled with. Patriarch Vivifiant understood that now. Except, if he admitted fault right now, then it wouldn't matter whether Su Qing was currently alive or dead. Floating Fiend would perish. If Floating Fiend hadn't become an imperial sovereign already, then it would have been a simple matter. The Patriarch could just track him down and do what needed to be done to resolve the situation. After all, his death wouldn't have been significant compared to the survival of the species. But, as soon as Floating Fiend became an imperial sovereign, he became vitally important to the species. Having reached this point in his train of thought, Patriarch Vivifiant sighed again. He knew that there was no way to determine the truth of the situation right now, but no matter which angle he analyzed the situation from, and no matter how much of a disadvantage he was in, he needed to protect Floating Fiend. It was the most sensible thing among all the insensible options. Floating Fiend, I sure hope you made the right decision. Taking a deep breath, he looked at the forces arrayed against him. I am the Patriarch of the Vivifiant Holy Land, and I hereby swear upon the Tao that I have never seen this Su Qing that you seek. Su Qing has nothing to do with me, and nothing to do with our holy lands. My species. Before he could finish speaking, his face fell and he backed up, his cultivation base powering up. He had taken Flame Phoenix seriously from the beginning. Moonlight couldn't be underestimated. Sealing County and the human army caused his heart to sink. The arrival of the 2 gods from humankind made things very tricky, and the fire moons were terrifying. But as of this moment he was truly flabbergasted. The moment he backed up, a woman's hand appeared outside the Holy Land's spell formation. It pushed down gently on the shield. The moment that happened, the spell formation emitted rumbling sounds that quickly grew deafening, followed by loud cracking sounds. Cracks spread out from the palm, quickly sweeping over the shield to create what looked like a spider web. As the entire mountain swayed back and forth, immense amounts of spirit energy poured into it to make repairs. But the pressure from the hand stopped all of that. A domineering will crush down with heaven-rending, earth-crushing force. At its height, the spell formation that had protected the vivifiant Holy Land for tens of thousands of years couldn't have been broken open by anyone other than a Grand Emperor. But it had become run down over the years, losing much of its power. And since a second Grand Emperor had never appeared among the vivifiants, it had never been repaired. As a result, the power of that hand was pushing it toward the brink of what it could sustain. The formation started cracking like a broken mirror. Intense rumbling sounds exploded out. The formation shattered, and the shrapnel became a tempest that raged directly onto the Holy Land itself. Patriarch Vivifiant's expression flickered wildly as he threw his hands out and unleashed the power of his cultivation base in an attempt to block it. In the end, he managed to block a portion of the tempest, but about 30% of the shrapnel hit the Holy Land. The mountain quaked as crevices opened up all over it. The peak itself was wiped out. As for the vivifiants, many of them didn't even have a chance to react before they were shredded into ashes. Only then did the owner of that hand slowly appear. In that instant of revelation, everyone, be they in the east, west, south or north, regardless if they were from Sea Ceiling, Holy Tide or Moonlight, bowed their heads. That included Flame Phoenix. Greetings, Empress. This person was none other than Empress Summer Departure of humankind. It was not the Empress in the flesh, though, but rather a projection. Even still, the altar god might that weighed down was astonishing. She stood as straight and tall as a mountain, surrounded by swirling destiny aura and dazzling light. Looking down at the rubble of the spell formation, the devastated Holy Land, and the pale-faced Patriarch Vivifiant, she calmly said, "You're right, Su Qing isn't here. And you don't have anything to do with him. But you have another Imperial Sovereign involved. Plus a third person. Since you'd clearly rather die than cooperate, your Vivifiant Holy Land will hereby be sealed. And if Su Qing is dead, then this place will be your tomb." With that, Altar God sealing power descended onto the Vivifiant Holy Land as well as every member of the species. It became like chains. The Patriarch was no exception. After being wrapped up in the chains, and feeling the immense pressure, all of the Vivifiants were compelled to drop to their knees. Some of them coughed up blood, and seemed like they might explode. The Patriarch trembled and tried to resist the pressure. His head swam. Finally, he bowed his head. The Empress stood, looking into the depths of the Forbidden Sea, in the general direction of the continent of South Phoenix. A few breaths of time passed in which she seemed very thoughtful. Then she looked away and coolly said, "Send an imperial decree throughout the east of Revered Ancient. Seal all borders. No teleports will be permitted. No traveling. No crossing between regions. Whoever finds Imperial Tutor Su Qing will be awarded with a destined opportunity leading to Godfire. All shall heed this order, including heaven, earth, rivers, lakes, plants, vegetation, living beings, heavenly Daos, and gods." The Empress' words were heard throughout the east of Revered Ancient, as well as the Forbidden Sea. Countless living beings trembled in response. Godly entities stirred excitedly, and numerous non-humans suddenly started thinking about the potential benefit to be had. What happened next, though, shook everyone in the east of Revered Ancient even more deeply. Words echoed out from the direction of the Fire Moons. Let the east of Revered Ancient heed the Dermic decree of the Fire Moons. All living beings, including gods, will respect these words. Find our Grand Dark Heaven Su Qing. The reward is a destined opportunity leading to Godfire. Humankind issued a decree. The Fire Moons issued a decree. The two decrees overlapped, becoming the most paramount level of will possible in the east of Revered Ancient. The echo of the words became like an asteroid slamming into the sea, sending out endless waves that became a tsunami and a hurricane at the same time. Every location in the east of Revered Ancient was abuzz. Even going back countless years to ancient times, nothing like this had ever happened in the east of Revered Ancient. People everywhere were going crazy for Godfire, and as a result were searching for Su Qing. That was especially true of the godly entities, who were more active than ever before. Gods were no exceptions. This was a destined opportunity leading to Godfire. and not just leading to the chance to ignite it, but to the fire itself. Deep in the Forbidden Sea, Floating Fiend had erased all traces of himself, and had even disguised himself as a human as he made his way carefully along. He had also transformed the tumor on his shoulder so that it looked like a huge sword strapped to his back. Projecting his voice, he said, "That pagoda you're in might be mysterious, you little brat. But there are some things which are simply foreordained." Inside that sword was the pagoda, and inside of the pagoda, Su Qing sat with his eyes closed as he meditated. Chapter 987, Floating Fiend's Pressure. Su Qing has gone missing. The humans issued a dharmic decree saying that whoever finds Su Qing will have a destined opportunity, leading to Godfire. The Fire Moons issued a similar decree to all the gods in the East. The dharmic decrees issued by humankind and the Fire Moon Dark Heaven people, and especially the rewards offered, instantly sparked a huge commotion in Revered Ancient. It was like a wind that started in the Forbidden Sea, blowing from South Phoenix into Emperor Receiving Prefecture. From there, it filled Sea Sealing County and then the Holy Tide region. Eventually, it became a hurricane that covered everything in the east. In the east of Revered Ancient, all the regions, all the counties, all the prefectures, all the species, all the organizations, and all the sects, whether they were righteous or evil, were all hit by astronomically large waves of shock. Everyone issued orders to start looking for Su Qing. Almost immediately, figures shot out from species and groups, scattering in all directions to start the search. Some experts with high cultivation bases used their respective organizations' prized treasures to expand the area they could search. Sects and species alike mobilized their members to join the ranks of the search. The east of Revered Ancient was buzzing. At any given moment, countless cultivators were out looking for Su Qing. Plants and vegetation, mountains and rivers, heaven and earth, countless godly entities, all were going mad. A destined opportunity leading to Godfire was inherently an astonishing level of good fortune. After all, the process of igniting Godfire was incredibly difficult, and the ceremony involved was very complex. There was a lot of uncertainty involved, plus it required extensive preparation and precious materials. In addition to all that, there were a host of variables. Whether it was Crimson Mother's godchild or the Grand Steward of the Fire Moon Dark Heaven people, both had failed despite all their best efforts. From that it could be seen how difficult the process was. But as of now, the human empress had shifted from the path of cultivators to the path of gods. She was now a first-level altar god, whose words could surpass natural and magical laws. Her story had already spread through Revered Ancient, so when she said she would give a destined opportunity that could lead to Godfire, then it meant the chances of success were incredibly high. Add in the Fire Moon Dharmic decree, and it made that destined opportunity even more enticing, and led to a level of madness among countless entities. An altar god and 3 flawless gods were jointly offering a destined opportunity to reach Godfire. For all intents and purposes, that meant that the chances of success were as close to 100% as could be possible. Many godly entities couldn't hold back from roaring as they burst into motion to join the search. There were even gods in the Godfire level who felt similarly. Wherever their lairs were, they woke up and sent out their godly auras to scour the east of Revered Ancient. To them, it wasn't a matter of malicious intentions or good ones. It wasn't a matter of being righteous or evil. All they cared about was attaining omniscience. And omniscience came from improving a god's personhood. Finding Su Qing would just take such gods one step closer to omniscience. Therefore, it was no exaggeration to say that on this day, the east of Revered Ancient exploded because of Su Qing. No one didn't hear about what was happening. No one was unaware. The reserve powers being tapped into ensured that Su Qing's name, though already in the forefront, now glittered even more brilliantly than before, like a star shining above Revered Ancient. The majestic hurricane raging in the east was obviously noticed in other locations in Revered Ancient, and that ensured that Su Qing's name spread even farther. Organizations throughout the mainland could truly sense that the east was home to a peak level of power, and that power came from the humans and the Fire Moons. To the Redland Noble Plexuses, the North Fate Kings, and the Netherworld Chasm Corpses, this search for Su Qing was symbolic of something else. What it truly signified was the first demonstration of the power and will of the alliance of humankind and Fire Moon Dark Heavens. Domineering might was being revealed in the east of Revered Ancient. That might was truly shaking things in all directions. The redland noble plexuses and other top species could sense it very clearly. There were others who could sense it as well. And they were the other terrestrial-level Holy Lands similar to the Vivifiant Holy Land. They immediately ordered the members of their own species to return to their respective Holy Lands and keep a low profile. Now was not the time for any of them to cause trouble and incite disaster. This display of power by humankind and the Fire Moons resulted in a huge search for Su Qing. It was a hurricane that just kept getting bigger and bigger until it surpassed the will of heaven, and in fact everything else. Actually, the discussions among various organizations became part of the growing hurricane. For example, out on the Forbidden Sea in a spot somewhat close to Emperor Receiving Prefecture was an island occupied by the Seemamoths. The chatter in their marketplaces was a microcosm of what was happening throughout the east of revered ancient. The Seemamoths were generally humanoid in appearance, but didn't look like humans much at all. For one thing, their average height was about 3 meters. They were green from head to toe, were covered with dense scales, and had long trunks that hung down their chest, similar to those of elephants. Surrounding their trunks were masses of tentacles that made them look very gruish and ferocious. Despite their appearance, they were actually more kind and gentle than some of the violent species on the Forbidden Sea. That, coupled with the fact that their lands were close to Emperor Receiving Prefecture, ensured that their lands were a popular spot for commerce on the open sea. The marketplaces on their islands were usually filled with cultivators from a variety of species. At the moment, the marketplaces were bustling, with a cacophony of voices filling the air. While many people were doing business, there were also a lot of people discussing the news about Su Qing. This fellow Su Qing was actually famous in the Forbidden Sea years ago. He comes from the continent of South Phoenix, and was a disciple of South Phoenix. Over the decades he has slowly become a legend. It really defies imagination that someone like him would go missing and cause such a commotion. This situation is totally crazy. This one person has thrown the East of revered ancient into complete chaos. As the discussions raged, there was one particular middle-aged human cultivator who was making his way through one of the markets. He who wore tight clothing, had a big sword strapped to his back, and he pulsed with the fluctuations of the great circle of Foundation establishment. As he heard the talk around him, his expression remained neutral. He just listened and walked. He was none other than Floating Fiend. Although he had concealed all traces of himself including his karma, he still needed to go out and get information about what was going on in the world, including matters related to himself. Though Flame Phoenix's search had ultimately failed, Floating Fiend could sense that he was in great danger. That was why he had come to this place. In the course of his eavesdropping, he eventually heard people in the marketplace talking about what happened at the Vivifiant Holy Land. Holy Land Schmoly Land. That Vivifiant Holy Land was acting all kind and virtuous before, but they were obviously harboring evil intentions. How bold and reckless of them to be involved in Su Qing's disappearance. They're complete idiots. Didn't they even take a minute to consider who Su Qing is? Flame Phoenix himself stepped in to help Su Qing. A huge army from Seasealing County came to take the lead, and top experts from the Moonright region came as well. The army from the imperial capital showed up, along with the 3 gods from the Fire Moons and 2 human gods. Even the human empress stepped in, crushing the defenses of that holy land with one blow, and crushing their patriarch. Ultimately, the entire Holy Land was sealed. Did you hear what the empress said in the end? If Su Qing perishes, the Holy Land will become a tomb. The empress' words were about as domineering as you can get. I know which words you're talking about. In the east of revered ancient, all shall heed this order, including heaven, earth, rivers, lakes, plants, vegetation, living beings, heavenly Daos, and gods. Enthusiastic conversations were going on everywhere. Nobody seemed to notice that one particular middle-aged human cultivator, who looked visibly shocked. So, it seems your name is Su Qing, he projected into the sword with divine will. Inside the dilapidated pagoda, Su Qing calmly opened his eyes. Although he couldn't sense what was happening outside, he was able to make an educated guess based on what Floating Fiend had just said. Voice cool, he responded, the fact you know my name seems to indicate news has spread about me going missing. In that case, it makes you wonder how your Vivifiant Holy Land is doing right now. Floating Fiend said nothing in return. The news he had heard about his home caused killing intent to swirl within him, but at the same time he felt immeasurable pressure weighing down on him. Back when he started chasing Su Qing, he'd known that he was pursuing someone important. That was obvious given the terrifying karma threats. As a result, he had prepared himself mentally before coming out. However, the fact that this incident had resulted in such a dramatic situation in the east of revered ancient was a bit too much for him. For that empress to be able to destroy a holy land's grand spell formation with a single blow would require a cultivation base of Grand Emperor at the very minimum. And they're also talking about the 3 gods of the fire moons. I'm not sure what level those gods are. In any case, the fact they issued decrees that stirred up the entire eastern portion of revered ancient means that this situation has become very tricky indeed. Floating Fiend's heart just kept sinking as he stood there on the island. Feeling very uneasy, he turned to leave. But then, a frown appeared on his face as he looked off into the distance. All of a sudden, the island trembled. The shaking filled the island, causing even the mountains to sway back and forth. Countless cultivators looked around in pure astonishment as the rumbling sounds turned deafening. Then, a huge head rose up from the water just outside of the island. The head resembled that of a crocodile, and was about as big as half of the entire island. It had black scales and emanated a terrifying godliness that turned into a massive pressure over the island. Huge waves surged out in all directions. The sea mammoths looked over in abject terror. But after only a moment they seemed to realize what was going on, and they quickly dropped to their knees and bowed, crying out to their god. At the same time, their high priest flew out excitedly to offer pious obeisance. This godly entity was the god that they had worshipped for years on end. However, for many years, this godly being had been little more than a legend, and no matter what calls they issued, never appeared in person. There were even times when their species had been forced to relocate to different islands due to the threat of extinction, and yet the god never showed up. Even the high priest had started to believe that the godly entity they worshipped was nothing more than a legend invented by their earliest ancestors. But now, the god had actually appeared. The moment the god was visible, a boundless divine will spread out, almost like a terrifying roar. Fine, Su Qing. For me, as soon as the divine will spread out, every member of the sea mammoth people prostrated, their minds spinning. At the same time, they instinctively acknowledged the orders. The godly entity's divine will swept back and forth on the island for a moment. Then the god sank back down into the sea to continue its own search. Floating Fiend disappeared the moment the godly entity showed up. After vanishing, he reappeared deep on the seafloor, his expression dour. The news had been bad enough, but then he saw an actual godly entity on the prowl, and he knew full well it wasn't an isolated incident. The words he had heard spoken on the Sea Mammoth Island kept reverberating in his mind. In the east of revered ancient, all shall heed this order, including heaven, earth, rivers, lakes, plants, vegetation, living beings, heavenly daos, and gods. However, a moment later, Floating Fiend's eyes shone with cold determination. Alright, let us see how wide your search for Su Qing will really spread. Can you really issue orders that all living beings will follow? Chapter 988. Floating Fiend breaks down. Similar to the Holy Tide region, the South Isle region bordered the sea. In the wilderness there, Floating Fiend raced along, this time disguised as a non-human. He had been traveling in disguise for 2 days. At first, he had intended to go along the seafloor until he reached the outer sea. It seemed to him that if the search for Su Qing was going on in the east of revered ancient, then the outer sea would be a safe place to hide out. The outer sea was a dangerous place. It wasn't somewhere to enter blithely, but it seemed like the perfect place to stay out of sight. Unfortunately, when he realized that there was some sort of invisible sealing magic separating the inner and outer seas, he eventually had to give up on that plan. That sealing magic came from the orders issued by humankind and the Fire Moon Dark Heaven people. By using godly might to manipulate natural laws, they sealed all exit routes. Getting too close to that magic would make it difficult to keep his disguise up. After studying it very closely, his heart sank. Ultimately, he turned and went in the opposite direction. His next plan had been to just hide out on the seafloor. But during the 2 days that had passed, He sensed the streams of divine will scouring the seafloor increasing constantly. There were more of them and they were more densely packed as time went on. It was as if all the godly entities in the sea were joining the search. Even the water itself gave Floating Fiend a very strange feeling, as if the currents around him were somehow growing in number. And then there's that flame phoenix who seems to be scanning the sea constantly. If things keep going on like this, the Grand Emperor's treasure won't last much longer. I need to get out of this area. The sense of pressure and danger eventually forced Floating Fiend to give up on his idea of going to the outer sea, and also his plan to stay hidden on the seafloor. That was what led him, not to Sea Sealing County, but to the South Isle region. There weren't many human forces in the South Isle region. Instead, the place was controlled by 7 mid-sized non-human species. Normally speaking, they didn't have much contact with outsiders, and thus the area had a reputation for being isolationist. The terrain in the region was primarily mountainous, although there was a huge desert on the border. The region seemed like the perfect place to hide out, except for that very reason, it was the subject of a lot of attention in the search for Su Qing. Sadly, Floating Fiend had no other good options. The upside is that, even though this place is in the east, it isn't controlled by humans. Keeping such thoughts in mind, Floating Fiend entered the region. As he traveled, he continued to change his appearance every so often, and made sure to sever all traces of his passage, as well as any karma. And thus, he proceeded carefully through the mountainous wilderness. All the while he continued assimilating the dilapidated pagoda in the hopes of getting to Su Qing, who was inside. Sadly for him, the pagoda was mysteriously powerful, and the bubble's force of rejection kept resisting him. The assimilation process was going very slowly. That just increased Floating Fiend's anxiety. He was particularly frustrated by Su Qing. He had only said one thing to Su Qing earlier, only for Su Qing to use that to deduce some important information. Over the following days, Su Qing had resisted him with greater intensity, and had occasionally attempted to send out messages via divine will. Though he managed to sever all such streams of divine will, preventing them from going out, they still left him feeling increasingly glum. Su Qing, still seated in a cross-legged position, was now about half recovered from his injuries. At a certain point he sent out a message via divine will. "You didn't answer my last question. I guess that just proves that your vivifying holy land is in a bad situation." He got no answer. I suppose another possibility is that it doesn't exist anymore. Su Qing's expression was placid, with godliness dominant within him. He was incomparably rational. Thus, despite the fact that he wasn't a person who liked to talk much, he knew that his only way of getting information about the outside world was to interact with this imperial sovereign. That means that you must be on the run right now, being chased by humans. You're probably looking for a good hiding place. Floating Fiend was no fool, and therefore, no matter what Su Qing said to him, he didn't provide any response or feedback. And yet, his heart only continued to sink and sink. Thankfully, his impression of the South Isle region turned out to be mostly correct. Even after traveling through it for a few days, he didn't encounter any streams of divine while searching the place. After weighing all the options, he finally picked a cave in which he sat down cross-legged to hide and focus on assimilating the dilapidated pagoda. However, his moment of peace and quiet only lasted for a few hours. As night approached, rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth outside of Floating Fiend's cave as several streams of divine will swept through the area. All of them came from powerful experts. Floating Fiend's eyes opened, and they shone with the utmost vigilance. About 6 hours later, the divine will moved on. However, before Floating Fiend could breathe a sigh of relief, an even more terrifying will arrived, accompanied by a godly might that could crush anything in its path. It filled the area, causing the sky to shake, the land to quake, and mountains to sway back and forth. It was from a god. Floating Fiend's expression flickered as he took out his shears. The authority of erasure spread out, adding to the concealment effect he had around him. Outside of his cave, a great wind blew. Within that wind was a very gruish voice. Su Qing. It was hoarse and seemed to conform to an indescribable rhythm. This was clearly a god who was issuing a cry bolstered by godly authority. Outside, wild colors flashed in heaven and earth. Meanwhile, the sword on Floating Fiend's back vibrated, and within the dilapidated pagoda, Su Qing's eyes opened. At that moment, Floating Fiend quickly made a decision. Biting the tip of his tongue, he spat out some of his precious Dao blood onto the shears. The shears vibrated and the rust spots on them expanded, but the shears did manage to erase all traces leading to him. Eventually, the voice faded away. Floating Fiend's face looked incredibly pale. As of now, he didn't dare to stick around. After confirming that the god was gone, he raced off. This time he didn't put the shears away, but instead used the authority of erasure constantly as he fled. In that manner, 2 more days passed. He passed through countless mountain ranges, shifting directions constantly, until he eventually reached a desert. The entire time he was jumpy with fear. He ran into the will of gods a few times, and without his Grand Emperor shears, he would definitely have been discovered. Sadly, the constant use of the shears was wearing them down significantly, and because he was consistently forced to use his precious Dao blood, his cultivation base, which had just experienced a breakthrough, was destabilizing. Unfortunately, he had no other options. The pressure he felt kept growing more intense, until he found himself in the desert. There, he transformed into a host of sand grains that started moving with the wind. On the first day, everything proceeded normally. On the second day, Floating Fiend in sand form suddenly lurched to a stop as he caught wind of a strange singing off in the distance. In 10 miles of sand I looked for you, for 100 miles of swamp I examined each clue, through 1,000-mile tomb you fled and flew, 10,000 miles of bamboo passed through my view. Floating Fiend, oh Floating Fiend, where could you be? Perhaps I'll just wait for you to come to me. The song was gruish and sinister, and when it sank into Floating Fiend's heart, he felt waves of terror assailing him. And that was because the song mentioned his name. As the song echoed through the desert, the sand vibrated and floated up into the air, turning into numerous little hands that almost resembled swaying stalks of grass. Astonishingly, the song emanated from those pieces of sand. As it drifted back and forth, it caused a terrifying sensation to build within the visibly astonished Floating Fiend. It gradually turned into an intense sensation of deadly crisis. Breathing heavily, he unhesitatingly detonated half of the sand that made up his form, which turned into droplets of Dao blood that splattered onto the shears. A loud cracking sound rang out as he severed all karma and all traces of himself. He even severed the time belonging to the shears, as well as its own essence. To Floating Fiend's senses, everything around him turned blurry. When it became clear again, he was away from the desert, having used the essence of the shears to teleport to safety. He was now in an unfamiliar swampy region. The moment he appeared, he couldn't stop from coughing up a massive mouthful of blood. Before the blood could even land on the ground, he reached out, took the blood and erased it out of existence. He couldn't leave any traces of himself. The terror in his eyes was clearly visible. What level of god was that? That god very nearly had me within its omniscience. Breathing unsteadily, Floating Fiend hurried along. Things were just getting more and more dangerous and also increasingly gruish. Though he had an imperial sovereign cultivation base, he felt like he was walking the line between life and death. Before he could get his bearings, his heart lurched all of a sudden. And it was because the water in this unknown swamp was stirring, the mud was trembling, and the plants around him were swaying. Even the bugs seemed to be on the move. It was as if everything around him had a will of its own. There wasn't much of that will, and it seemed to be pure instinct. But that instinct was searching for him and for Su Qing. The sense of danger within Floating Fiend exploded to new heights. There wasn't time to do much thinking. He unleashed more of the essence of the shears, and an instant later, he disappeared without a trace. After a number of teleportations through different areas, the shears were getting rustier, and Floating Fiend was feeling increasingly exhausted. That was when he found himself in front of a bare mountain that looked like a tomb. That was when the lingering fear within him disappeared. However, his heart was now like dirt that had been baked by the sun until it cracked. Su Qing then sent out another message with divine will. "You're running out of time. Shut up," snapped Floating Fiend, which was the first time he had responded after all of the various dangers he had been through. Only 2 words were spoken. But they were enough to cause Su Qing's eyes to glitter brightly. He had his answer. Seems time really is running out for you. Looking very grim, Floating Fiend cut off the divine will from Su Qing. The killing will in his heart bubbled. Let us see which happens first, me assimilating Su Qing, or you people finding me. With that said, he turned to leave the mountain. Except that was when boundless and never-ending clouds surged on the horizon. They were like the sea rushing in his direction. Within those clouds it was just barely possible to see a gigantic baby, crawling along rapidly. Heavenly might came with it, almost accompanying it, as the baby wailed and cried out for daddy. It seemed furious. The sound caused natural law to tremble and magical law to prostrate. Floating Fiend's eyes went wide. Heavenly Tao, he blurted in shock. The shears appeared overhead, and again he unleashed their power. A loud cracking sound rang out as more cracks covered the shears. They now looked to be in horrific shape. However, Floating Fiend did manage to vanish. When he reappeared, he was completely and utterly lost. All he could do was pick a direction based on instinct and intuition. As he fled, he heard the crying baby several times, as well as numerous instances of the aura of gods and spirits. Each time he used the shears, no matter how much it pained him to do so. Over and over again he spat out Tao blood. After fleeing for 8 days straight, he was feeling completely exhausted. However, he found a location where there was no divine will, no cry of a baby, no chanting of a god. There was only a bamboo forest that went on for 10,000 miles. The bamboo was bright red. When the wind blew, the bamboo leaves rippled like a crimson sea. The sound of the leaves rustling against each other seemed like wind blowing through a desert and causing the sand to scrape against itself. Along with that sound came something like a nursery rhyme that caused Floating Fiend to completely break down. In 10 miles of sand I looked for you. For 100 miles of swamp I examined each clue. Through a 1,000-mile tomb you fled and flew. 10,000 miles of bamboo passed through my view. Floating Fiend, oh Floating Fiend, where could you be? Perhaps I'll just wait for you to come to me. That nursery rhyme slammed into his mind like heavenly lightning. At the same time, a god strolled through the sea of bamboo. The canopy of heaven turned red thanks to his arrival. The earth became filled with crimson fog thanks to his presence. Time became a river stained with scarlet thanks to his approach. All of that red, from heaven to earth to time, converged to create a bright red robe. The newcomer was a handsome middle-aged man with long flowing hair. Each strand of that hair was like flowing light, and emanated a godly might that would cause suns and moons to lose their glory. This goddess' name was Yuluchen. Striding forward until he was right in front of the trembling Floating Fiend, he laughed softly. Floating Fiend, oh Floating Fiend, where could you be? Perhaps I'll just wait for you to come to me. Floating Fiend's mind was spinning, and he had completely lost any power to fight back. He couldn't even think properly. The nursery rhyme echoed in his mind, reminding him of everywhere he had been as he fled. Out in the boundless void, there was a host of clay figures bearing a shrine as they marched through time. They were headed in the direction of the same bamboo sea where Yuluchen stood. Erniu was among the clay figures, waving his god vine and casting his senses about. A languid voice drifted out of the shrine. It's no use, Nyo. Stop tormenting that little vine. I know where Su Qing is. Chapter 989. A Storytelling God. A cool breeze picked up outside of the 10,000-mile bamboo forest. The red bamboo stalk swayed back and forth, creating a faint rustling sound. It was not like the sounds of nature. It surpassed that. Floating Fiend's mind and heart were in turmoil as he felt himself becoming a part of that sound that surpassed anything from nature. It affected his entire body until he was trembling everywhere, and his thoughts seemed to be fading into nothing. However, that fading of thought wasn't happening very quickly, and thus he had time to recall what had just played out. The 10 miles of sand represented the desert he had been to. The 100 miles of swamp was obviously the unknown swamp he had fled through. The 1,000-mile tomb was definitely the bare mountain, while the 10,000 miles of bamboo was the forest in front of his very eyes. The nursery rhyme had correctly described the exact route he took. It was almost as if everything from the moment he entered the desert had been fabricated by means of the nursery rhyme. It was a Gruish type of godly authority, and its name was storytelling. By the time Floating Fiend's thoughts led him to the point of being aware of this godly authority, he was defeated. His mind became blank. His gaze became vacant, and he entered an ethereal daze as he stared at the 10,000-mile forest and the god standing in front of him. To him, the figure in front of him was immeasurably large and could control everything. It had omniscience regarding everything. He had become a character in a story, a fabrication. He couldn't think because of course the thoughts of a character in a story are controlled by the person creating the story. He couldn't move, as the actions of a character in a story are determined by the person telling the story. He even lost the ability to feel fear or confusion. To a certain extent, the person telling the story was actually very kind in that regard. The merciful Yu Luchin lifted his right hand and made a cupping motion. A ripping sound could then be heard as the long sword on Floating Fiend's back was torn off his body. It flew up into the air. As chunks of disgusting flesh and bones tumbled off it, it revealed the very dim bubble and the pagoda within it. Smiling, Yu Luchin projected a message into the pagoda. Well, I say, there's a person in there. Inside the pagoda, Su Qing quietly stood. Then he walked out of the pagoda, through the bubble, and into the presence of Yu Luchin. Greetings, Senior, he said, bowing his head. Although Su Qing had considered that someone would come to his rescue, none of his various analyses had featured Yu Luchin as the rescuer. It was true that Yu Luchin had, to some extent, worked together with Grand Emperor Swordsage right before the latter perished. But from Su Qing's perspective, Yu Luchin had seemed grouish and unpredictable, both in thought and action. In an instant, he could change from being happy to furious, or from being malicious to benevolent. It made it almost impossible to get a read on him. Hold on, aren't you Swordsage's successor? Yu Luchin asked with an enigmatic smile. Su Qing cleared his thoughts, clasped hands and bowed very respectfully. Your grace in rescuing me will be forever engraved in my memory, Senior. Yu Luchin chuckled. He waved his right hand, and a host of bamboo stalks flew over and created a table in front of him, atop which rested 5 cups of tea. There was also a furnace off to the side, the flames of which heated a worn teapot. It took only a moment for the water in the teapot to boil. Then 5 streams of water flowed out of it, which entered the 5 teacups. A fragrant aroma began to fill the area. Having accomplished that, Yu Luchin sat down cross-legged, picked up one of the cups of tea, and took a drink. You say you'll engrave it in your memory? Are you referring to the current version of you, in which godly nature is dominant? Or are you talking about the version controlled by human nature, the version in which things are easily forgotten? Su Qing thought for a moment. Then he took a blank bamboo slip out of his bag of holding, upon which he carved 6 words. Huge favor owed to Yu Luchin. He put the bamboo slip back into his bag of holding and looked at Yu Luchin. I'll use that to remember. Yu Luchin's eyebrows shot up in amusement. He looked a bit more closely at Su Qing. Interesting. Well, sit down and have some tea. Su Qing didn't hesitate. He sat down, picked up a cup of tea and took a drink. After the scalding tea passed down his throat, it seemed to explode. Heat spread through his entire body, slamming into his mind, and stirring up all of his memories going back to his youth. Those memories were like images floating up in his mind. He saw Peerless City. He saw the bitterness he experienced as a child. He saw the first time he killed someone, and how withdrawn he had become afterward. He saw the death of Grandmaster Bai. He saw the camaraderie he had experienced in 7 Blood Eyes. He saw his conflicted reaction to facing Zi Qing. He saw Palace Lord Kong and Grand Emperor Swordsage. He saw Plumdark, Linger, and his eldest brother. And yet, all of those experiences, all of those images somehow seemed unfamiliar, as if they were from someone else's life. The joys and sorrows, the vicissitudes of life, didn't seem capable of affecting his heart. But then, because of the heat of the tea, the memory images became more colorful and vibrant. The happiness, anger, sorrow, and joy became more obvious. Ultimately, they became so prominent they were like peals of heavenly thunder, cracking endlessly. Rumble. Su Qing shook from head to toe with joy. Rumble. His mind spun as he felt fear, then anger, then confusion, and then sadness. All of the various emotions and longings of human nature came out in force. To him, the world was different compared to before. It was more colorful. Panting for breath, Su Qing looked up. His expression was no longer calm like it had been before. All of the human nature that he had struggled to keep suppressed before was now bubbling. It was once again forming an equilibrium with the godliness he had intentionally released. What was more, uncontrollable killing intent toward Floating Fiend appeared in his heart. Su Qing immediately turned to look at the disoriented Floating Fiend, his eyes burning with the desire to kill. But only an instant later, he took a deep breath and looked back at Yu Luchan. Standing, he clasped hands and again bowed deeply at the waist. Many thanks, Senior. Yu Luchan took a drink of tea. There's no need to thank me. I came here mostly to satisfy my curiosity. Su Qing hesitated as he tried to wrap his mind around what exactly Yu Luchan had been curious about. Looking closely at Su Qing, Yu Luchan said, I'm curious about a person with a body made of eminent desolation as flesh. Before you, nothing like that ever happened. So I came. To be honest, if I hadn't come, someone else would have rescued you. And soon at that. That's why you really don't need to thank me. I don't want any big karmic connection to develop between us. Su Qing looked down thoughtfully at the bamboo table. Yu Luchan had drunk tea from one cup, while Su Qing had drunk from another. But there were 3 other cups. But I do have to say, this whole thing is very, very amusing. Smiling, Yu Luchan waved his hand at the befuddled Floating Fiend. Floating Fiend shivered as he regained both his senses and his ability to move. His pupils constricted as confusion and terror returned to them. Then Yu Luchan began speaking in a very casual and relaxed manner. Floating Fiend has some very nice shears. However, they can't fool my eyes, let alone the eyes of that empress you humans have. Besides, from beginning to end, your master never said a single word. Of course, you have no way of knowing that after you went missing, both humankind and the Fire Moons issued dermic decrees. Every organization you can imagine sprang into action. They cooperated perfectly. The East of Revered Ancient has been working together as if it has a single united will. That was quite intimidating to the other areas of the mainland, and it was quite intimidating to the Holy Lands around here. At the same time, many forces used the search for you as an excuse to deploy troops and plan for war. Some of the details are even impossible for me to perceive clearly. Yu Luchan clucked his tongue in admiration. Su Qing had no trouble picking up on the hidden implications in what Yu Luchan said. He sighed. As for Floating Fiend, what he had heard already had him feeling extremely nervous. My guess, Yu Luchan continued, is that your Empress' next move is going to be using your situation as a justification for kicking the Holy Lands out of the East. It would be completely logical to claim that it's to make sure nothing like this happens again in the future. By paying only a small price, the entire East can be purged. No wonder Swordsage picked her. Yu Luchan's eyes narrowed as he looked at Su Qing. This really must have been tough for you. All twists and turns, right? Gods really can be ruthless. Rough. So rough. Su Qing couldn't think of anything clever to say. Looking at Yu Luchan, he said, That's pretty deep, Senior. Hearing that caused Yu Luchan to smile happily. He was intentionally trying to sow discord, for no other reason than he found it amusing. Except, his smile faltered when he heard what Su Qing had to say next. However, Senior, the situation with me isn't that simple. If things really played out as you just described, it seems more likely to me that my master has been paying attention the whole time. Senior, isn't it possible that you showing up was actually part of what my master predicted would happen? Yu Luchan blinked a few times. After what Su Qing just said, he suddenly didn't feel as amused as before. I actually looked thoughtful. That was when Floating Fiend's eyes filled with madness. Spinning, he unleashed every scrap of his cultivation base and aura, paying every price possible, including as much Dao blood as he could spare, to try to flee. The Grand Emperor's shears appeared above him, and they slashed down toward him. Then a cracking sound rang out as the shears sliced through the air. Floating Fiend vanished. Su Qing watched it all happen coldly. Yu Luchan, meanwhile, didn't spare a second glance. Instead, he coolly said, Allow me to tell you a story, kid. The story is about a cultivator named Floating Fiend. He walked through a 10-mile desert, a 100-mile swamp, a 1,000-mile tomb, and a 10,000-mile forest. Eventually, he got lost. But then he got lucky and managed to find his way back. In a show of gratitude, he blew himself up, and then he took a drink of my tea. All of a sudden, the spot where Floating Fiend had just disappeared rippled and distorted. Floating Fiend appeared, dilapidated and weak. In fact, he seemed like he was about to collapse. The moment he appeared, he looked at the two people present as if he hadn't seen them for an entire month. His expression was one of absolute astonishment and unending terror. A month ago, he had severed his karma with his shears, then detonated the essence of the shears to perform a greater teleportation. After that, he fled for a month, experiencing all sorts of deadly situations. He crossed numerous dangerous regions, only to return to this very spot. Trembling, he looked at Yu Luchan, then unhesitatingly decided to self-detonate. Rumbling built up within him. It was the only way he could think to free himself. But then he became lucid again and found himself staring at the same bamboo forest, the same Su Qing, and the same Yu Luchan. He did not wake up where he thought he would wake up. Instead, he woke up here. "Have some tea," Yu Luchan said coolly. Floating Fiend looked at the cups of tea on the table. Trembling in despair, he reached out, took a cup and drank. Meanwhile, the distant horizon turned gray, as if it were turning into clay. The effect spread as a procession of clay people appeared, bearing a shrine. Among the team was Erniu. Looking very excited, he waved at Su Qing. "Little Ah Qing, your eldest brother is here." Chapter 990. And now I'm the hunter. When Su Qing saw the clay people and the shrine coming over the horizon, he knew exactly who was on the way. And upon seeing Erniu, all of the exhaustion Su Qing felt after having been hunted and experiencing the assimilation process faded away. An instant later, the clay people were hovering in midair overhead. Erniu excitedly stepped out of the procession and dropped down next to Su Qing. There he punched Su Qing softly on the shoulder, causing a stream of warm power to flow through Su Qing. When Erniu sensed how weak Su Qing was, and detected the evidence of how many times he had exploded, he said nothing. He just winked and laughed. "Little junior brother, tell me, when you were running for your life, were you thinking of me? Let me guess. Whenever I'm not around, you have a hard time stomaching food. You don't sleep well. You just can't get used to life like that. I bet your cultivation even gets boring. No matter what you did, you felt like something was missing. Did I guess correctly? Well, did I? Ha ha ha. Come on, there's no need to feel embarrassed. It's fine. Just muster up the gumption to tell the truth." Erniu was clearly feeling very pleased with himself, and yet, he didn't forget to butter up Yu Luchan while he was at it. Turning, he bowed deeply and plastered a very flattering look onto his face. Well now, this handsome and elegant individual, who has such a noble demeanor and an imposing bearing, could only be the legendary senior with the most noble of spirits, Yu Luchan. In his presence, the glory of heaven and earth fades, while the starry sky glitters brightly for his sake. "I am your humble servant Chen Erniu. Greetings, senior." As Yu Luchan sat there with teacup in hand, he looked Erniu up and down, blinked a few times, and then smiled as if in amusement. "Su Qing, this eldest brother of yours really held nothing back. He was the first one to realize that you went missing, and he sent jade slip messages to about half of the east of revered ancient." When Su Qing saw his eldest brother and heard Yu Luchan's words, a smile broke out on his face for the first time in a long while. He was about to say something when the shrine up above glittered. A wind blew and the shrine's curtain parted, revealing a clay fox within. The clay fox initially seemed like an inanimate object, but in the blink of an eye, it filled with such color that it seemed to be alive. And then it really became alive as it transformed into a bewitchingly charming young woman, who stepped out of the shrine and into the bamboo forest. Her ample bosom swayed with her as she walked, while her hourglass figure and astonishing curves were enough to cause anyone's heart to start racing. There were few other words that could describe her other than perfect. She wore gauzy red clothing that only half covered her, and looked like it might fall off at any moment. Her skin was so fair it was almost translucent, and her curvaceous body was so attractive that anyone who looked at her would be overwhelmed with the desire to be with her. Once in the bamboo forest, she stepped over to Su Qing's side and then spoke in a languid voice that dripped with charm. "You gave your primal yang to someone else behind my back, you naughty little boy. Because of that, I wasn't planning to come rescue you." Su Qing didn't react to her words. Instead, he put on a brave face and bowed in greeting. "Well met, senior." The clay fox snorted coldly. Then she looked him up and down. She seemed pleased. I have to admit that Nyoer was right, though. Now that you have this new body, you basically have all your primal yang back. Ernyu cleared his throat and smacked his chest. That's right. I might try to trick other people, but I would never try to trick you, Mayam. What's more? Now that my little junior brother has a new body, he is definitely going to be more passionate than before. Look, this body of his is virtually bursting at the seams. That energy and blood is burning sky high. He looked at Su Qing and blinked a few times. Su Qing said nothing in response to Ernyu's strange words. Whatever the clay fox said. I'm not going to quibble with you. It seemed that her heart had started racing in response to what Ernyu just said. And she even licked her lips instinctively as she looked Su Qing up and down again. How slutty you, Luchin said coolly. Starfire paid no heed to his words, and instead turned to look at Floating Fiend with eyes so cold they seemed to be a gaze on a dead man. So you're the filthy imbecile that conspired to take Su Qing's fleshly body? Ernyu also looked at Floating Fiend. His eyes filled with icy killing intent. Ernyu wasn't sure how much killing intent others felt toward Floating Fiend. But at this moment, his desire to put Floating Fiend to death couldn't have been more intense. Though he had seemed relaxed up to this point, and had bragged a bit to Su Qing, the reality was that he just wanted to ease some of Su Qing's exhaustion after a period of such intense danger. In fact, there were few people in the world who had been more anxious than him. And when he sensed how weak Su Qing was and how many times he exploded, his heart burned with flames of rage. And that rage wasn't just directed toward Floating Fiend. He was also angry with the Empress. I'm not the only one who had a goddamned plan at work. Therefore, the fact that this whole thing went so south is something I sure as hell am not going to forget. As Ernyu snorted coldly in his heart, he looked at Floating Fiend with more and more killing intent. Floating Fiend shivered and felt like he was about to collapse mentally. The woman who had just arrived was also a god. What was more, he detected a bit of the aura of an altar god. That indicated that this god was at the ultimate peak of flawless god. His despair ran as deep as the sea, and he knew that there was no escaping this situation. He just hoped he could die quickly. That was his only hope. Except that earlier self-detonating hadn't done a thing. The only way out of this will be to get one of these gods to kill me outright. Having reached the conclusion that this was definitely the best idea, he suddenly lunged toward Su Qing as if to attack him with full force. In reality, he was just hoping to die. Su Qing, his face completely calm, didn't attempt to dodge. He just looked coldly at Floating Fiend closing in on him. Starfire reached out and gently tapped Floating Fiend's forehead. A rumbling sound echoed out as Floating Fiend's cultivation base shattered. A tremor passed through him, and he deflated like a popped balloon. In an instant, he was emaciated and weak in both aura and fleshly body. However, he wasn't dead. Then Starfire spoke, and the words caused his withered body to shake uncontrollably. What we see here isn't the full you, right? That's why you're trying to get yourself killed. Starfire was absolutely correct. Floating Fiend wasn't here in full. It was only part of him. After sensing the karma connected to Su Qing, he had obviously made certain preparations. He had also taken precautions in case he failed and ended up dying. Specifically, during the chase, he had used an immortal skill that had been passed down in his species. It was a very Gruish immortal skill that involved inscribing one's memories into a seed that could be planted in another life form. When activated, the memories would erupt, and in a process very similar to reincarnation, he would take over that other life form and become a new version of himself. If his plan went smoothly, then he wouldn't have any need to activate the immortal skill. But if things didn't go smoothly, then after he died the skill would activate. In that case, even if he did perish, he would essentially be resurrected. Right now, he wanted to activate the immortal skill, except that even dying now seemed like a luxury. Su Qing's eyes looked both cold and thoughtful as he walked toward Floating Fiend, who was now completely incapable of fighting back, thanks to High God Starfire. As he neared, Floating Fiend managed to look up at the human he had very nearly assimilated. Took effort, but he managed to grin in a very scornful manner, and even put some killing intent into his eyes. He didn't speak, but he made his attitude clear via his facial expression. He was telling Su Qing, "Without help from others, you would have become a part of me. You are nothing." Su Qing understood what that look meant, and he also understood the reason for the look. Floating Fiend wanted to die. Therefore, upon nearing, he took Floating Fiend's bag of holding, then lifted his hand. A dagger appeared there, which he stabbed into Floating Fiend's body. Blood flowed out. Face completely expressionless, Su Qing pulled the dagger out, then stabbed it again. And again. And again until he stabbed him 8 times. From the moment he first saw Floating Fiend until now 9 days had passed. But he only stabbed him 8 times. As blood flowed down Floating Fiend, and his aura fragmented, Su Qing's shadow slowly covered him. Su Qing issued a command via divine will, and Little Shadow opened its mouth and started devouring Floating Fiend's shadow. At the same time, the God Vine emerged from Su Qing and viciously burrowed into Floating Fiend and started chewing him up from the inside. Floating Fiend shook as a look of indescribable pain filled his bloodshot eyes. He shrieked in astonishment, and yet managed to hold back from expressing pain. He wanted to die, but death was slow in coming. As his fleshly body experienced torment, Su Qing lifted his right hand, put his hand on the top of Floating Fiend's head, and started to assimilate his soul. He had practically no soul threads left, and he needed to replenish them. There could hardly be something more suitable than the soul of an imperial sovereign. Floating Fiend shook violently as his soul collapsed and was assimilated, bringing pain that far surpassed anything from his fleshly body. He wanted to fight back, but the suppression from High God Starfire shattered any ability to resist. He was like a piece of fish meat that could do nothing but allow Su Qing to assimilate him. In fact, it was almost exactly how he had been trying to assimilate Su Qing earlier. The roles had been reversed. Time passed. The assimilation continued. Su Qing's soul threads formed anew. The pain turned into a sea of despair, until Floating Fiend couldn't suppress it anymore. Face distorting, he unleashed a howl of anguish. Su Qing's expression remained placid in the face of the howling. Eventually, his soul threads were fully recovered. At that point, he turned to look at Ernyu. Ernyu naturally knew what that look meant. Licking his lips, he stepped forward and clamped his hand onto the trembling Floating Fiend. In the blink of an eye, the image of the heavenly dog appeared, voracious and full of killing intent. His jaws snapped. Floating Fiend's screams grew shriller. After enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn, Floating Fiend's soul was so shattered that only a bit of it was left, keeping his life force from dispersing. The soul of an imperial sovereign was too much for Su Qing and Ernyu to contain. Therefore, Starfire helped them to take the portion they currently couldn't eat, and convert it into a host of soul pearls. The sparkling and translucent soul pearls were so impressive that even one would send a host of cultivators into a frenzy. However, Su Qing's revenge wasn't over yet. Having assimilated the soul, his eyes glittered with coldness as he unleashed the profound sun immortal light magic. As a sun, he rose up into the air, becoming a golden crow that spat fires of assimilation onto Floating Fiend. The fire, combined with the magic of the immortal light, was completely terrifying. Eventually, the golden crow devoured the entire fleshly body to burn and assimilate it internally. Su Qing wanted to see if he could actually assimilate Floating Fiend's authority of erasure. Now that Floating Fiend's fleshly body had been devoured, the only thing left behind were the dilapidated shears. Su Qing collected the shears up, his eyes shining with ferocity. "You want to assimilate me? Fine. I'll assimilate every scrap of you." When it was done, Su Qing turned to Yuluchen and Starfire. He bowed. Yuluchen put down his cup of tea. "You owe me a favor," he said coolly. "Once you've taken care of certain matters, I'll come looking for you." With that, Ha disappeared along with the bamboo forest. After Ha was gone, the surroundings turned into a majestic desert. High God Starfire looked at the spot where Floating Fiend had disappeared and sighed. "Do you need me to help you find the rest of that filthy thing?" Su Qing shook his head. "I'll always remember your kindness, High God. I can handle what's next." Starfire smiled and then said some words that were very similar to those spoken by Yuluchen, except with a very different meaning. "That's fine. I suppose you owe me a favor now. After you take care of certain matters, I'll come looking for you, okay?" High God Starfire licked her lips and seemed more charming than ever. Su Qing hesitated. The god swayed back to the shrine and turned into a clay fox. Then the clay people carried the shrine back up into the sky and off into the distance. The desert was now empty except for Su Qing and Erniu. Erniu looked at Su Qing and grinned. "What are you going to do next, little Ah Qing?" Su Qing's heart was full of icy killing intent. Looking in the direction of the Forbidden Sea, he narrowed his eyes and spoke in a voice like a blade. "He still owes me. Now I'm going to be the one hunting him." On the seafloor in the Forbidden Sea, a snake-necked dragon swirled along hunting for prey. However, just as it opened its mouth to devour its target, it suddenly shivered as five-colored light built up in its eyes. Memories that weren't its own erupted in its mind, becoming a tempest that swept through its fleshly body with devastating force. It exploded in a bloody haze. A moment later, the chunks of flesh converged back into a humanoid shape. Its eyes opened, and though they looked blank at first, they quickly became lucid and then grim. "Looks like my true form failed." The person who had formed from the exploded snake-necked dragon looked around. He suddenly felt uneasy. Which of the people connected to that brat by karma ended up killing my true form? Regardless, I'm obviously very weak now. I'm not even as strong as an imperial sovereign. I guess I need to follow my original plan and find a place to hide out. Suppressing his anxiety, he raced off to find a hiding spot. Chapter 991. Today they all stand for him. Near the sea in the South Isle region, a deafening sound could be heard in midair, accompanied by an immense gale force wind. Everything shook. Shockingly, two figures were visible within the tempestuous wind, screaming along at high speed. They left behind two streaks in the canopy of heaven as they pierced through the air. Nothing seemed capable of slowing them down. There were powerful organizations in South Isle, as well as godly entities, hidden gods and living beings in all parts of the land, who, as long as they had the power to see, made sure they did nothing to block Su Qing's path. They just watched him pass by. The waves made by Su Qing's disappearance had spread very far, and as a result, his name was known just about everywhere. He was the Grand Dark Heaven of the Fire Moons. He was also the imperial tutor of humankind. In the East of Revered Ancient, he was about as important as it was possible to get. Because of him, all of the East of Revered Ancient had been thrown into a big commotion. The Empress of Humankind and the three gods of the Fire Moons had offered an incredible opportunity. This went to show what both species really wanted, and also revealed who was in charge of the East. And thus, although the South Isle region was sparsely inhabited, it was located in the East, and therefore even people there had heard of the Dermic decrees issued by humankind and the Fire Moon Dark Heaven people. All sorts of organizations were paying very close attention as Su Qing and Erniu left the desert and headed toward the Forbidden Sea. As they made progress, word began to spread that Su Qing was free. However, even as the news began to spread through the various regions, Su Qing himself issued a Dermic decree in the Holy Tide and Night Spirit regions. Holy Tide and Night Spirit hereby declare war on the Vivifiants. It was a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering decree. In Sealing County, which formed the core of both Holy Tide and Night Spirit, the decree caused an instant stir. Teleportation portals were activated on a large scale. Squads of elite cultivator veterans poured into the portals to carry out the orders of their region lord. And thus, an army gathered outside the Vivifiant Holy Land. War was about to break out. At the same time, Flame Phoenix issued a Dermic decree in the continent of South Phoenix. The continent of South Phoenix hereby declares war on the Vivifiants. Godly entities from Forbidden by the Phoenix took action, causing shocking fluctuations to flow out into heaven and earth. Seven Blood Eyes hereby declares war on the Vivifiants. On islands throughout the Forbidden Sea, countless declarations echoed that made by Seven Blood Eyes, and killing intent began to converge on the Vivifiant Holy Land. The Moonright region hereby declares war on the Vivifiants. The heir apparent and his siblings had not left the Forbidden Sea. Upon hearing that Su Qing was free, and after hearing about the declarations of war, they added their voices to the mix. In the shortest of moments, all of Su Qing's allies took action. Spell formations were activated, and forces converged on the sealed Vivifiant Holy Land. This was what happened when Su Qing went on the hunt. And the first step in taking out Floating Fiend was to rip up his holy land by the roots. Su Qing was definitely the type of person who held grudges. That was how he had been since he was young. If someone treated him with hostility, he would take their life, even if it was before they could actually take action against him. Given that, there was little need to mention Floating Fiend, who had very nearly killed him. And since Floating Fiend was an imperial sovereign from the vivifiant Holy Land, there was no way that the Holy Land would get off without repercussions. The grudge had been established, and there was no way to simply make it go away. What was more, killing Floating Fiend wasn't going to be enough. If killing was to be done, there needed to be a lot of killing. And if extermination was going to happen, it would be a holy land that ended up exterminated. That was the way to prevent any future calamities from occurring. In addition, track down Floating Fiend. His people must pay with their blood. Up in the dome of heaven, Su Qing's eyes overflowed with killing intent. Next to him, Erniu licked his lips, and his eyes seemed to glow with the color of blood. You're not thinking straight, little Ah Qing. There are some things in which one shouldn't expect to be spoon-fed. It might taste good, but then you don't gain the experience of peeling the food yourself. If you want experience, then after you sacrifice the vivifiant Holy Land, I can personally use the blood of that species to use my Grand 5-Ox Essence Tracing Grand Merciless Tao. That way we can figure out exactly where that shithead is and go put him to death. Erniu's words echoed about as the sound of their passage pierced the clouds. Shortly after, they flew out into the sky over the Forbidden Sea. Without a moment of pause, they shot down through the waves into the water and moved in the direction of the vivifiant Holy Land. Along the way, countless sea beasts burst into motion, becoming a swelling wave that shot toward the vivifiants. Godly entities rose up from the seafloor and joined them. When the two of them finally arrived on the periphery of the vivifiant Holy Land, Su Qing was met with a soul-shocking majestic scene. Countless banners flapped vigorously in the wind. Innumerable cultivators were arrayed in ranks, pulsing with baleful auras that caused the wind and clouds to change colors dramatically. The cultivators present included the legions from the Holy Tide region, the priests from the Night Spirit region, a massive armed force from the imperial capital, as well as 7 Blood Eyes forces and allies from species all over the Forbidden Sea. There were also cultivators from the Moon Rebel congregation in the Moonright region. There seemed to be no end to the armed forces surrounding the vivifiant Holy Land. Hovering up above were many familiar faces that caused warmth to rise up in Su Qing's heart. The heir apparent, Princess Brightblossom, Grandma Fifth, 8th Sib 9th Siblinger was there. Also present was King Firecrusher, as well as the Patriarch of 7 Blood Eyes, Sir Bloodsmelter. Powerful experts were present from the regions of Holy Tide and Night Spirit. High above everything else was Flame Phoenix, who blotted out the sky and sun, and was surrounded by a never-ending sea of flames that immolated the sky. At Flame Phoenix's side was Second Elder Sister. Everyone present was ready to unleash every bit of might they could muster, and they were waiting for Su Qing. When Su Qing strode over the horizon, his footfalls created rumbling sounds, and his presence created a surging momentum. Greetings, Region Lord. Our respects, Imperial Tutor. Well met, Dao Child. Archbishop of Moon Rebel. Various forms of address could be heard coming from different parts of the enormous army. Though the words spoken were different, the respect and fervor were exactly the same. He was the Region Lord of Holy Tide and Night Spirit. He was the Imperial Tutor of humankind. He was a Dao Child of 7 Blood Eyes. He was one of the archbishops of the Moon Rebel congregation. As he journeyed through time, he had accumulated these titles one by one, based on his own merit. Back during the days when he was tempering himself, he had held back from revealing his various identities publicly. As his master had demanded, he focused on bettering himself. But in the course of his training, Floating Fiend had come along and tried to kill him, and thus he arrived today in this manner. He was unleashing everything he had. When he arrived, ear-splitting rumbling sounds spread out, like heavenly thunder. He was only about 50 kilometers away from the Holy Land at this point. As for the vivifiant Holy Land, its spell formation had already collapsed, and the vivifiants inside trembled in despair. Thanks to the pressure weighing down from all sides, their souls and bodies were experiencing intense pain, and most of them had blood oozing out of the corners of their mouths. Patriarch Vivifiant's facial expression was grim. Over the past few days, He had prepared in every way he could manage, but when he saw Su Qing coming over the horizon, his heart started pounding. The worst-case scenario he had imagined was becoming a reality. Floating fiend failed. Patriarch Vivifiant felt immeasurable bitterness within himself as he watched Su Qing approach. Therefore, it was without the slightest hesitation that he shifted his gaze to King Firecrusher. King Firecrusher, he said loudly, please notify Empress Summer Departure that the Vivifiant Holy Land is willing to surrender as a species and become subsidiaries of humankind. This is a species oath backed by the destiny of our species. If humankind agrees, then from generation to generation after this day, we will abide by the agreement. Patriarch Vivifiant was the leader of the Vivifiant Holy Land, and as such, he had his own plans and ideas. From the moment he decided to protect Floating Fiend, he had already analyzed the situation as a whole. But since the worst-case scenario was playing out in front of him, he didn't have a lot of options to pick from. On the one hand, it was true that the almighty entity from the Empty Star Holy Land had a towering cultivation base, and betraying that individual would be very dangerous. However, he had no options left. Therefore, he kept speaking. As for me, I'm willing to receive a soul branding mark from the Empress, and will even switch cultivation paths. I will change from the cultivator path to that of the gods. I will ignite my own god fire. In other words, I'm willing to completely part ways with the Holy Lands. In response to his words, countless eyes outside of the Holy Land shifted to look at King Firecrusher. King Firecrusher said nothing in response. Su Qing didn't stop moving. He was now only about 15 kilometers away from the Vivifiant Holy Land. Seeing that, Patriarch Vivifiant continued speaking. If I become a god, then I should be able to reach the altar god level. If that happens, I can be of immense assistance to either humankind or the Fire Moons. And that means that when the more powerful Holy Lands arrive, you'll have more options to pick from. He feared that almighty individual from the Empty Star Holy Land, but if he could ignite god fire, then he wouldn't be a cultivator anymore. He would be listed among the gods. And he was fully aware that the plans of that almighty individual were contingent on avoiding conflict with the gods. Although it wasn't a complete guarantee, considering the immense potential danger, it was the best option he could think of. And thus, he said what he did to King Firecrusher. He knew full well that the only hope he had right now was to appeal to the Empress. The Empress was a god, the god of humankind, and that ensured that her actions were for the benefit of her species. The Empress obviously could have tracked down Floating Fiend, but instead, she used it as an opportunity to reveal her intentions. From that, I can deduce that my previous speculations were correct. The Empress believes that absorbing my species will strengthen humankind. And that means that it doesn't matter what Su Qing thinks or feels. And yet, despite the fact that he was convinced of his own line of reasoning, the fact remained that King Firecrusher wasn't saying a thing. As Su Qing continued his approach, everyone parted to make way for him, leaving a path that led right to the Vivifiant Holy Land. Patriarch Vivifiant ignored that. Empress Summer Departure, he said loudly, I know many secrets of the various Holy Lands. I know the real reason why the Holy Lands came here. And even more importantly, I know where the next set of Holy Lands will arrive. Revered Ancient is about to be engulfed in the flames of war. It's unavoidable. But with my information, humankind can gain a huge advantage. Su Qing is sound and in good health. Floating Fiend presumably already paid the price for his actions. Therefore, Empress, I request that you drop this matter. Let the blame fall squarely on Floating Fiend, and allow his punishment to be the benefit gained by humankind. Isn't that a good way to resolve this situation? Patriarch Vivifiant looked up into the canopy of heaven. He could sense that the Empress was there. He still hadn't even cast a glance in Su Qing's direction, and was instead just waiting for a response from the Empress. He was convinced that he and his species, plus the information he had, were valuable enough that they could make up for Floating Fiend's actions. Clasping hands, he bowed to the canopy of heaven. At that point, King Firecrusher finally reacted. He frowned. The surrounding armed forces, be they from Moonright, Seven Blood Eyes, South Phoenix, Holy Tide, or Night Spirit, all remained in place, neither speaking nor acting. As far as they were concerned, the person who was going to make the decision here wasn't the Empress, but rather Su Qing. And finally, Su Qing arrived in front of the vivifiant Holy Land. He looked it over calmly, then looked up at the canopy of heaven. He was also interested in the Empress' response. Next to him, Erniu's eyes were narrowed, but glinted with a terrifying light. Finally, the Empress responded in a cold voice. It might seem like a reasonable choice to let one person be humiliated in order to gain an advantage for the entire species. But years ago, when Sealing County was in a deadly situation, this person with a mere core formation cultivation base did something that seemed like the act of a fool. He stood up for the people of Sealing County even though there seemed no hope of achieving success. The Moonright region used to be a grazing land for Crimson Mother. But this person, with only a nascent soul cultivation base, stood up for the people of the region and saved them. Before I ignited Godfire, back when our species was in conflict with the Fire Moons, he single-handedly went to their territory and became the Grand Dark Heaven. And then, in front of all of the Fire Moons, he demanded a ceasefire. He bears the Emperor's sword. He earned a 30,000-meter pillar of light in the assessment of the heart. And he has the same heart now as he did back then. Therefore, let me ask you a question. If I turned a blind eye while he suffered humiliation, then what exactly would be the point of being human? What about the next time a human got humiliated? What about the time after that? If I let one of my people be humiliated just to earn an advantage for the species, well, maybe you would think something like that might be worth it. But in my eyes, there is no advantage in doing such a thing. Maybe I am a god, but I'm a human god. I'm not the kind of god people just think about. I'm not the kind of god who lurks in the shadows. I'm a human of revered ancient. And I stand with my people. Su Qing stood up for everyone. And today we're standing up for him. Therefore, I hereby reject your offer of surrender. As the words left her mouth, heaven and earth rumbled as if with thunder. The Vivifiants looked on in despair. Their patriarch's face was ashen. Never could he have imagined that the response to his offer would be something like this. All humans present felt their hearts pounding with pride. The iciness in Erniu's eyes eased a bit, and he snorted coldly in his heart. The violent irritation he had felt earlier toward the Empress was starting to fade. Su Qing looked back to the vivifiant Holy Land. Today, the Vivifiants are to be exterminated, he said calmly. Yes, sir. The armed forces replied. Baleful auras flared, becoming a majestic and furious wave that surged toward the vivifiant Holy Land. At the same time, the mountain erupted with corpse energy. The door from forbidden by the zombie that Patriarch Vivifiant had taken was being opened. Taking advantage of the chaos that ensued, Patriarch Vivifiant vanished. When he reappeared, he was on the horizon. Without a backward glance, he fled. He knew that there was no hope for the vivifiant Holy Land, and thus there was no point in him staying behind. If he could escape, then there would be hope for the future. But then the Empress appeared in midair and took a step toward him. When her foot landed, ripples spread through the canopy of heaven. It wasn't he just in that location. Ripples appeared in the sky over all the regions of revered ancient. The Empress's footfall affected daytime throughout revered ancient. Areas throughout the mainland that were brightly lit experienced something like the extinguishing of a lamp, as all daytime turned into the black of night. All regions were now dark. A god had blown out a lamp, causing all light to temporarily leave revered ancient. The only light now existed in the eyes of the Empress as she hovered in the air above the vivifiant Holy Land. This was the Empress' godly authority. The concept of departing light converged in her eyes, making them the source of all light. And then the concept of light flowed from all regions in revered ancient, converging into the darkness to make the glow of dawn light. Where that light went, heaven and earth became bright. Patriarch Vivifiant shivered as the light swept over him. As he blurred from head to toe, he reached out with his right hand as if to grab something. He opened his mouth to speak, but then within that light he became nothing. The only thing that remained behind was a helpless sigh echoing out in all directions. It became the end of everything. Next, all heaven and earth returned to normal. Then Flame Phoenix let loose a cry that could shake the heart and mind, and a massive sea of flames descended. The fire burned the sky, burned the air, and burned the mountain that made up the Holy Land. it continued down into the sea, making everything a world of fire. However, it only targeted the Vivifiants. Within that sea of fire were cultivators from all over, and they were on the warpath. Rumbling sounds echoed out, accompanied by the din of slaughter. The sounds weaved together into an energetic song being played in heaven and earth. Suqing merged into that sound. His slaughter came with the sound. In the depths of the forbidden sea, the fleeing floating fiend shivered as a sensation of unspeakable sorrow filled him. He looked over his shoulder in the direction of the Vivifiant Holy Land. The Patriarch just perished. Chapter 992 Vivifiant Extermination. Patriarch. Off on the horizon, the Empress Godly Authority wiped Patriarch Vivifiant out of existence. At that moment, a sigh echoed out in all directions. Howls of grief echoed out from the mouths of the Vivifiants in the Holy Land. An instant later, a never-ending sea of flames swept over everything. Where it went, the might of destruction abounded. It gathered within the Holy Mountain, specifically at the forbidden by the zombie door that Patriarch Vivifiant had opened just before he died. The fire closed the door. After, the huge army of cultivators surged into motion. They were like an enormous hand descending from heaven, carrying a will of death onto the Vivifiants' holy mountain. Death swept over their entire species. Terror and despair overtook the hearts and minds of all Vivifiants. Some of them simply stood there trembling. Some tried to flee. In some, the terror transformed into madness. With the Patriarch dead, the elders were the ones to assume the will of the species. Enraged, they flew out and called out to the other Vivifiants to fight. But an instant later, rumbling sounds echoed out as that enormous hand arrived. The entire mountain shook as deafening booms rang out. When that huge hand hit, the Vivifiant resistance crumbled. Countless Vivifiants coughed up mouthfuls of blood, and yet some of them still flew out to try to fight back. Sadly for them, the hand's momentum was unstoppable, ensuring it crushed everything in its path. Those who flew out fell almost instantly. The cultivator army that made up the hand then became like a swarm of bees that hit the Holy Land with mountain-toppling, sea-draining force. Miserable shrieks, howls of madness, and cries of anguish mixed together and echoed out in all directions. The mountain trembled violently as cracks spread out over its surface, and boulders tumbled down into the sea below. Slaughter broke out everywhere. This army was made up of Imperial soldiers, Sea-Sealing County armed forces, and warriors from both Moonright and Seven Blood Eyes. Even if the Holy Land had been more majestic than it was, there was no way it could stand up against such numbers. In the end, it was only the most elite of the cultivators who actually entered the mountain. But even that was enough to call it a full-scale invasion. In the shortest of moments, an explosive battle erupted, and Vivifiant corpses started piling up. The majority of the cultivators on Suqing's side were tasked with sealing off the outside world. That involved using spell formations to tightly seal heaven, earth, the air, magical laws, and the mountain itself. In other words, it made sure the Vivifiants had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The only thing in store for the Vivifiants was extermination. There was no other option. As the sounds of slaughter spread from the Holy Land, Suqing's godly authority of sound erupted within every bit of noise in the area. Wherever he went, the sound became deadly. Heads flew off of shoulders. Bodies exploded into gore. The killing intent was shocking to the extreme. He required slaughter. His experience over the last 10 days had left him with very tight nerves. Being chased down to be killed had left him feeling as bedraggled as a stray dog. The constant rushing around, the repeated collapse of his fleshly body and the pain that came with it, led to a towering killing intent. Suqing wasn't a person who enjoyed being down and out, and slaughter was essentially a permanent fixture in his life. Originally, it should have been possible for the Holy Lands to get along with him harmoniously. It hadn't been his desire for friction to erupt so quickly with the Holy Lands. He had simply been sitting there waiting for the giant and the dragon chariot. But an imperial sovereign's son and his Tao protectors had let their greed get the better of them, and therefore, killing it would be. Thus, a wind kicked up from the sea, bringing sea water with it as it blew onto the Holy Land. It mixed with the slaughter, spreading from the bottom of the mountain all the way to the top. At the foot of the mountain, A void-returning Vivifiant looked completely insane as he fought with Sir Bloodsmelter. Sir Bloodsmelter was old, but he was on the front lines that smashed into the Holy Land's forces. He had felt guilty from the moment he heard Su Qing went missing, and was fighting with every ounce of strength he had in the hopes of making up for that. A species that dares to touch my grand apprentice will be buried as a species. The coldness in Sir Bloodsmelter's heart manifested as innumerable blood threads that shot forth to devour his Vivifiant opponent. The Vivifiant's heart was full of madness, but he also knew that all signs pointed to imminent disaster. All he could hope to do was take some enemies with him. Eyes bloodshot, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, causing his energy to rise dramatically. He was opting for self-detonation, but then the wind blew past, and the shadow of death became visible right behind him. A dagger slashed. A head flew. The last thing he saw was the world tumbling around him. Sadly, he never saw who delivered the fatal blow. The only thing he saw were Sir Bloodsmelter's blood threads. The slaughter continued. If one could look down from high above onto the Holy Land, they would see corpses piling up everywhere. Some people were going completely crazy. Erniu was one of them. Turning into a host of blue worms, he spread icy frost everywhere, freezing everything around him. At the same time, his cold laughter drifted with the frosty wind. The Holy Lands don't count for crap. At the same time, in another location, a Vivifiant cultivator in the great circle of void returning was being beset on all sides. Blood sprayed out of his mouth as he tried to flee. He could tell that the only thing that awaited him in the Holy Land was death. His senses were full of the aroma of death and the sound of agonized shrieking. As death neared, his heart trembled. All of a sudden, he resorted to a secret magic that would hopefully get him free of the enemy forces surrounding him. He partly succeeded. The secret magic caused him to glow with a blood-colored light. It was a sort of blood escape art that could be used to break free of a deadly ambush. Unfortunately for him, he couldn't teleport past the spell formation barrier outside the mountain. All he could do was reach the foot of the mountain. Before he could even gain his bearings, the wind blew. A sensation of deadly crisis filled him that vastly surpassed what he had felt moments ago when being surrounded. It exploded within him, causing his head to spin. He lunged backward instinctively, yet couldn't prevent the wind from slicing his head off his shoulders. His senses of the world gradually faded as everything turned black. Blood sprayed as a corpse fell. The decapitated head landed upon a shadowy hand that stretched out of the wind. Then the hand and the head disappeared. When they reappeared, they were halfway up the mountain. There were more corpses there, as the Vivifiants were being absolutely decimated. The disparity in power ensured that any resistance on the part of the Vivifiants was absolutely meaningless. They struggled, but that only bought them a few more moments of life. And the price to be paid was injury and psychological torment. Even their smoldering god elders and other smoldering god experts were simply perishing under the assault of King Firecrusher, as well as the heir apparent and his siblings. Blood clouds gathered in the sky. A blood rain fell. The flames continued to burn, and thus, the blood rain evaporated into a mist that covered the mountain. Su Qing was like a death god walking in the world of mortals. Within the blood mist, he went from the foot of the mountain toward the summit. He was not particular in choosing targets. It didn't matter what cultivation base they had. As long as they were Vivifiants, they were marked for death. Void returning, spirit trove, nascent soul. They were all the same to him. The smell of blood grew stronger, and the screams grew shriller. Gradually, the number of screams began to diminish. Eventually, Su Qing stepped out of the blood mist and stood at the summit of the mountain. There were no more howls of agony coming from Vivifiant cultivators. The entire species had been eradicated. The only thing left behind were innumerable corpses littering the mountain. Most were mutilated. The blood had turned the white mountain completely red. Deep below the surface of the sea, forbidden by the zombies stirred because of the aura of death. But it was quickly suppressed by the pressure from above. On top of the mountain, Su Qing took a deep breath, looked around at everyone who had come to help him, and then bowed deeply. Next, he locked eyes with Ling. Ling had grown up. She'd known that Su Qing had important matters to attend to, and had held back from ever bothering him. When she realized he was looking at her, Her expression became one of wistful longing. His eyes softened and he nodded. Then he turned to look at Erniu, who was walking out of the blood mist. "Eldest brother," he said. Erniu knew what Su Qing wanted to say. Licking his lips, he took note of the aroma of blood that surrounded them, then laughed grimly. "Don't worry, little Qing. By using the blood of the vivifying species as a sacrifice, I can track him down. As of now, he doesn't have those gruish shears anymore. Plus he's weaker than ever. I'd say it's likely he isn't even in the imperial sovereign level." Erniu stamped his foot onto the ground and floated up into the air. Reaching toward the blood mist, he made a grasping gesture. Instantly, the blood mist filling the Holy Land filled with rumbling sounds. Then 5 hurricanes formed with Erniu in the center. Together, they rose up into the air, slowly orbiting around each other. Massive amounts of corpses were picked up by the wind and began to flow within the hurricanes. From a distance, it was an extremely ghastly sight, almost like some sort of evil magic. Erniu's eyes began to shine brightly as his hands flashed through double-handed incantation gestures. He began to chant, and the corpses within the 5 hurricanes started crumbling into pieces. When they were nothing but flowing gore, the 5 hurricanes looked even more horrifying. In the end, Erniu pointed up into the sky with one finger, and the 5 hurricanes shot upward. High in the sky, they converged to make a sea of blood that roiled loudly, spinning until it was a gigantic black hole. Looking at the black vortex, Erniu shouted, "Little junior brother." Su Qing didn't hesitate for a moment. The golden crow flew out of him, swirling through the air. Opening its mouth, it spat out the true form of floating fiend that it had devoured earlier. It landed next to Erniu. Erniu reached out and put his hand on floating fiend's head. His nails dug down deep until they pierced the skull, whereupon he began to chant in a voice that seemed profoundly ancient. "Blood as the guide, will as the reason, these bones and this cultivator, a soul within heaven and earth, bring it back to its origin." As his voice rang out, the black vortex spun more dramatically. Lightning danced back and forth like silver snakes. Gradually, an illusory scene began to form in the black hole. It started very blurry, but as the moments passed and Erniu's eyes shone more brilliantly, the blue light pulsing off of him seeped into the image. As the blue light stained the image, Erniu spat out mouthful after mouthful of blood, which also joined the image. It was almost like a purification. The image quickly turned clear. It depicted the seafloor. A shadowy figure was racing along there. He quickly noticed that he had been spotted, and turned to look over his shoulder. He was none other than Floating Fiend. A look of shock appeared, and then became a dour expression. He quickly waved his hand as if to sever the connection. The image once again turned blurry. "Think you can escape?" Erniu laughed coldly. He burst into motion, shooting into the vortex. Su Qing took a step, also entering the vortex, pulsing with killing intent as he did. A flaming figure joined them from the mountain. As it blurred along, it turned into Huang Yan, who disappeared into the vortex. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the vortex vanished. The 3 figures were gone, leaving no trace behind.